Something twisted my brother's head clean off. I found out what it was. I wasn't the one that found Maddie. It was his wife, Elizabeth, back from a night shift at the hospital, eager to shed her scrubs and settle in for a long sleep. Instead, she walked into the bedroom to find Maddie sitting in a chair, his severed head in his lap. I would have preferred not to hear any further details about my brother's body, but when Elizabeth called me on the phone, hysterical, she couldn't help but overshare. Dark bruises covering his arms and legs. There was blood everywhere, soaking through his white t-shirt and striped pajama pants, pooling all around the wicker chair where he sat. The skin of his neck was frayed where it had been ripped apart, almost like a popped balloon. The muscle, too, was stretched and torn, and the vertebrae stuck from the top of his neck hole like a white sleeping worm. Though we hadn't spoken much in the last few years, I was the only family Maddie had left. I caught the next flight to Boston and met up with Elizabeth at her parents' house. She started screaming as soon as she saw me. Or maybe she'd been screaming all day. Maybe I looked too much like my brother for her to handle. After a few hours, she calmed down enough to start saying a few words. I asked her if Maddie had been in any kind of trouble. He'd been reckless in his late teens and early 20s, selling drugs on campus. It was small-time stuff, but he'd made a few bad enemies, guys that put a real scare into him one night that made him get out of the game altogether. There was nothing like that, she said. He's totally clean, got a good job clearing out old houses. Like, when someone dies, he gets all the junk out, gets it sorted, helps sort out the junk from the antiques, takes a commission of the sales. Does he skim? I asked. Maybe someone felt cheated. She shook her head. He buys the stuff he likes. But it's always a fair price. Everybody loved him. Everybody. The cops investigated, of course. But there were no leads. No evidence of a break-in. No one with a grudge. It was like Maddie had twisted his own head off and set it in his lap. One of the detectives mentioned that more than half of murders go unsolved. It seemed this would be one of them. Weeks passed, and I stuck around, trying to help Elizabeth put her life back together. Even after the police were done scouring her place, she refused to go back in. We hired some people to clean up the blood, but they told me there was only so much they could do. The hardwood in the bedroom would never give up that stain. Finally, it fell on me to go into the place and gather a few of Elizabeth's things. They were going to put it up for sale. She was still in pieces, planning to move back in with her parents, probably permanently. I rented a truck and some basic tools, told her I'd get to work. Up until that point, I'd been staying in a cheap Airbnb nearby, but with Maddie's house reopened, I figured I could spend a few nights there while I packed up. When I mentioned the idea, Elizabeth gave me a weird look. "You shouldn't stay there," she said. "Why not?" I asked, but she couldn't come up with a good reason. Of course, the day I got into the place, the first thing I did was head to the bedroom. I guess I just had to see it. The cleaners had clearly scrubbed the hell out of the place, but there was still a nasty stain in the center of the room. The mark was roughly circular and maybe 3 feet across, mostly gray but grew darker at the edges, almost black. Before she sold the house, Elizabeth would have to have the boards replaced, maybe put in carpeting. Something. For a few seconds, I just stood there, looking at the black circle, imagining my brother inside it, permanently. Once I'd spent a few moments staring, I looked up from the stain, really taking the place in for the first time. Elizabeth hadn't been kidding about the antiques. All over the apartment were old hutches. I called a phone number that answers any questions you ask it. Now, I doubt everything I have ever believed in. Imagine, just for a second, that you were me. You always thought of yourself as being a very special kind of person, someone truly meant for greatness. You believed money and fame were just around the corner, patiently waiting for you. You spent your 20s desperately searching for your life's quintessential purpose, convincing yourself that you would find it somewhere along the way. You dreamed of Oscars, Grammys, and championship belts, so you sweated, bled, and sacrificed, believing it would all pay off at some point. Your insignificant self trapped in a constant chase for meaning. Despite all the pain and isolation, those periods of your life were often your happiest. You thrived in the pursuit, living off this fragile sense of direction. But sooner or later, things always seemingly fell apart. When the pages you had frantically written in the past suddenly seemed cringeworthy and uninteresting. When you felt that once vicious fire inside you flickering again. When the comedic senselessness of your commitment overtook everything you once believed in. That's when you knew it was time to move on again. This is who you are, continuously jumping from obsession to obsession, always searching for the thing that will finally make you feel whole. Music, literature, academics, sports, you tried it all, leaving it behind only to find your next big fling. Until you're suddenly in your 30s, having wasted the supposed potential that once made up your entire identity, with nothing to show for it. Now, imagine you are walking down a busy street, on your way home from a job that really deserves no form of description, and you see an ominous flyer floating right into your hands. Looking for answers? Call the number below. Don't tell me you wouldn't have at least considered it. Of course, I wasn't stupid enough to actually expect some form of rainbow-colored unicorn to pick up the phone and tell me next week's winning lottery numbers. But what did I have to lose? My years of hopeless wandering left me with no real friends or partners. I spent my time in constant loneliness, either trying to achieve the momentary goal I set for myself or looking for the next big thing I could put my everything into. At worst, I would end up dialing the number of some sort of sex hotline and get an unreasonably expensive phone bill. At best, I would have finally found the solution to all my problems and insecurities. So I set up the call and nervously waited, secretly praying that some mystic entity would come and free me from my never-ending mediocrity and blinding nihilism. Beep, beep, beep. What the hell am I doing here? I moaned, letting out a small sigh. The time spent longingly staring at my screen slowly convinced me that I was acting like an immature teenager. Who in their right mind would pick up a flyer like that and actually try to call? Isn't this paranormal bullshit just some laughable distraction for me? With my finger already hovering over the end call button, a robotic voice suddenly addressed me. Welcome. One question per customer. Processing your answer could potentially take some time. You may state your question in any living language recognized by the ethnologue, languages of the world. What the fuck? I whispered, frantically trying to get my breath under control, picking up my trusty iPhone 8 that had fallen down the stairs in the process. I was sure that this was just some sort of elaborate AI a reckless prankster set up. I knew I would probably feel like an absolute idiot in about 5 minutes. But what rational human being would decide to hang up now? Who wouldn't at least try to get an answer? What am I really destined for? What is my life's ultimate goal, and what do I have to do to achieve it? The response came almost instantly. We have received your question. We will now process it and get. I work the night shift as an over-the-phone interpreter. I've done a lot of gigs with a lot of different monikers over the years. I guess you could say I've spent a long time looking for my true calling, but one of the things that's always come naturally to me is a passion for languages. I happen to be fluent in a couple, so it shouldn't be terribly surprising that today, I find myself working as an over-the-phone interpreter. It's a fairly simple job, if you've got the right skills. Guys like me work in a freelance capacity, that means no benefits, for a company which shall remain nameless, but which brings in a good chunk of folks like myself from a bunch of different places around the world. It's a home office job, so it can be done no matter where we are, and the company doesn't ask for much beyond a few quick evaluations to make sure you're able to effectively understand and convey information in the relevant languages and that you have a decent mic set up. It had been a good while since I had anything resembling a steady job, so even though I wasn't really planning on staying long between the no benefits and the pay not being great, I don't live in a first world country, so the company acts like they can give us the bare minimum and we'll just wrap it up, and a lot of the time, they're right. I decided to join up for a while. Now, even though the job is home office, long story short, we're expected to log on during certain hours to complete a shift, and the company's pretty stringent about this. My options were either to start really early in the morning, or do a half shift starting shortly before midnight and finish the rest at some later point during the day, usually after I woke up. I've always been more of a night owl than anything, so naturally I ended up going for option B. What did this mean for me, broadly speaking? Well, the company mostly gets calls from clients in the US and Canada asking for translations, but there's been a few times when I get connected to some kind of middleman operator who then links me to someone somewhere completely different, like the UK. It's some kind of network functionality the company has with other agencies. They have a name for it, but I always forget what it is. But hey, it gets the interpreters more work, so why not? Anyway, my time zone matches up with NOM, which is implied as where the vast majority of my calls come from. So at those late graveyard shift hours you tend to get a bunch of stuff that you wouldn't usually see during the day. There's police 911 dealing with all manner of weirdos, stalkers, junkies, drunkards, what have you. Or sometimes it's just hospitals having to look after pregnant women or people who ended up in the ER for stupid reasons. At any rate, it's a front in which you'd do well to expect the unexpected. It's also rather sleepy a lot of the time instead of the back-to-back calls you tend to get at other times of the day, which is just fine by me. Now, it's not an awfully rare occurrence for someone in my line of work to get calls involving people who are in some kind of uncomfortable predicament. Off the top, I recall a woman whose nurse had to remove some sponges placed into some surgery wounds were really stuck in there and ended up screaming bloody murder at the top of her lungs as they were taken out, or a really dejected sounding guy who'd ended up arrested when he'd been caught by the cops on a DUI charge because he went out to buy something for his little girl late at night. I've heard all manner of sob stories before I ever took this job, so these things never affected me terribly, but they were the sort of thing that tends to stick with you a bit. Out of all the calls I ever got, though, this one takes the cake. The call request came in as normal, and I picked up. Now, every time we answer a call we're expected to do a little spiel. Hello, I'm so-and-so, my ID number is blah blah, please speak clearly and make this easy on the both.